I remember Jesus said to me, I've called you to plant the church because I love you. And I was like, what? Like I paused and I'm like, I don't understand. And I think over time, as I went back to that moment, I realized that church planting for me was the best place I needed to be in to see that Jesus loved me deeply. And so I would say that every time I go through a difficult season, I tell myself, I'm not doing this because Jesus needs me. I'm not doing this because I'm better than someone else. I'm not doing this because people need a church, which is all true, right? It's like, I'm doing this because this is the best place for Jesus to show me how much he loves me.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Sowers Podcast. My name is Matt Naismith, and I am your host. On this podcast, we share stories from church planters and leaders who are influencing kingdom movement and impacting their communities. Whether you're a church planter, a pastor in a church, part of a church planting team, or just curious to learn more, our hope is that these conversations inspire you to be a sower in the places where you live, work, learn, and play. If this podcast blesses you, we'd love for you to share episodes and subscribe on your preferred platform. Now, let's dive into our next conversation. Welcome back, friends, to the Sowers Podcast. Thanks for joining us for this episode and this conversation. I hope you're having a fantastic day, getting ready for the summer. It's hard to believe, but the summer, at least in Southwestern Ontario, wherever you are listening from in Southwestern Ontario, about to hit the summer months. Kids will be out of school, oftentimes for relaxation, break, holiday, those sorts of things. And so whatever you're doing this summer, I hope you do get an opportunity to break. Related to that, we are going to be changing up the schedule a little bit over the summer, doing fewer episodes. There won't be weekly releases. There will be a release next week, but then we'll probably take a couple weeks between that release and the following one. And so still pay attention to the feed. If you're not subscribed or following, please go ahead and do that so you get updated when new episodes are released. But the format over the summer will be a little bit more laid back than a weekly release schedule, but not to worry. I'll keep you informed as things begin and as the summer progresses. Well, today I'm excited for you to hear a conversation that I had with Domenic Ruso, who's a pastor, author, and leader who believes that this is the best time to learn and engage new questions emerging from a secular culture. His passion for the church led him to plant the 180 Church in the greater Montreal region. Dom is constantly thinking of new ways to reflect on complex questions about faith, spirituality, truth, and how those intersect with faith in Jesus and the Bible. His graduate work in patristics and PhD in Reformation studies fuels his teaching in a way that seeks to stretch people to reimagine new paradigms that involve ongoing biblical engagement and the serious challenges of an emerging post-Christian culture. In this engaging conversation, Dom shares his journey from a Catholic upbringing in Montreal to becoming a pastor and church planter. He discusses the challenges and joys of navigating faith in a secular culture, the importance of listening to people's questions, and the need for the church to adapt its message for a modern audience. He also reflects on his upcoming book, which aims to bridge the gap between secular curiosity and biblical truth, emphasizing the complexities of spirituality today. In this conversation, Dom shares insights on engaging with non-believers, the importance of sermon preparation with audience awareness, and the reliance on the Holy Spirit in church leadership. He discusses the challenges of parenting in a secular culture while pastoring, and he also reflects on the sweetness of Jesus in his journey. He expresses hope for the future of the church in Canada, emphasizing the need for unity and adaptation in evangelistic efforts. I hope that's a helpful teaser as we get started. And so without further ado, here is my conversation with Pastor Dom Ruso. Well, Domenic Ruso, an official welcome to the Sowers Podcast. It is great to have you on today.
This is great, Matt. Thanks for having me.
You know, Jason Persad, I interviewed him, you know him well, and he said, You've got to have Domenic on the podcast. And I said, well, I'm already in communication with Dom to get him on. And so we do have you now on the podcast. Dom, I didn't tell you this in our chat that we had there before we jumped on, but I remember hearing you speak years ago at North Park.
Cool.
And I just need to encourage you because my parents were going through a real church hurt season. And so they came to North Park for the Saturday evening service.
I remember
during
that.
the season that you were there, and they just sat in a season of healing. And I know your teaching ministry really blessed them. So thank you for that season of your journey and the season of your life.
That's encouraging, Matt. Thanks. I mean, you know this, like as pastors or teachers, we're often sharing with different people, and obviously we believe the Spirit is at work in different ways, but at times we don't hear the ending of the story or the journey that people are on. So that's encouraging. Thanks, man.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Would you jump in for us, Dom? Something that we usually start with in this podcast is the sowing of the gospel in the guest's life. So how was the gospel sown to you? How'd you come to know Jesus Christ?
I think my earliest kind of moments that I would say I remember Jesus kind of tugging at my heart or becoming aware of God's love happened as a young boy in Montreal, Quebec, where I am right now. I live just north of the city of Montreal now, but I grew up in Montreal, and my parents kind of led us to understand Jesus through the context of our Roman Catholic upbringing. So I was an altar boy till I was about 13 years old. I don't think I understood kind of the gospel in the clear way, but I understood that God loved me, that God was there, that my parents wanted us to understand about God and the church. Those were the early seasons of I would say the seeds were being sown. That's the language I think I would use as well. And then when I was about 15 years old, my mom started attending a Protestant church. And that kind of, I would say, caused the seed that was sown to go through like a period of a storm, maybe like lots of rain, lots of wind, lots of things that were unstable in that journey. And that formed so many things in me. Good things and also difficult things we could talk more about this in the next few minutes, but like how are Catholics and Protestants and different Christians different, and why do they fight like about the Bible and Jesus? And so I think, a lot of the seed that was sown in me early on had to go through this period of struggle and discernment and reawakening, which kind of developed in my teenage years. And that kind of propelled me to, a deep desire to understand the scriptures better and understand church history better. But when I was I would say 15 or 16, as much as there was tension in my home, I remember just it being clear that I needed to say yes to Jesus in a way that was very honest and marking for me. And I would say the seed then took root in a new way. Like all seeds that grow, they eventually have to take root. And kind of my story flourished from there.
When did pastoral vocation, pastoral ministry come on your radar as a potential calling?
Yeah, that's a good question. I answer that question in different ways, but like, I really don't know. Like, I don't know because one, no one in my family had ever been a pastor. So I want to encourage listeners, maybe God's stirring in your heart to say yes to Jesus, and you don't have a path in front of you because no one else has done that. Just trust Jesus and walk anyway. You know what I mean? I kind of did that. I just sensed I love the Bible. I know a little bit about church. My background was in music. And so I was kind of exploring church stuff through a music path because I would just love music. One of my good friends in church had said, at the time he was a friend, became a youth pastor, said, why don't you think about doing a certificate like in theology? And I was like, what is that? And he said, well, if you love music and you understand theology better, maybe you could help in a church more often. And it was that simple. So I pursued like a certificate, like in theology, like anybody. And when I did that 1 year, which was in the intended, idea, it turned into like 3 years of falling in love with the scriptures and theology and learning. And eventually, I think it was in those 3 years that people started to say, Dom, maybe God is preparing you for more than just music and church, but maybe to be a pastor one day. And that's kind of how things kind of took root. But I don't think I had a moment when I was young thinking I'm going to be a pastor one day. I'm still shocked, actually. A lot of my family's still shocked that I'm a pastor.
Now, you made the eventual transition to church planting in Montreal, in northern Montreal, where you are now. I'm wondering if you could share just briefly how you arrived at church planting. I think there will be listeners listening to this. They're in established churches, pastoring various roles and responsibilities. You had some of those. How did you discern, man, church planting is the next thing? Because also I know a little bit of your background to know that probably opportunities to be a lead pastor in another church would have very much been a part of it. But why'd you say, hey, no, I'm going to move, maybe back to Montreal as part of that to plant a church?
Yeah, it's such a whirlwind of discernment, and I don't think I have a clean path, but I have some things I think that help me that might help others who are wrestling with this. I think that for me at the time, when I started to sense that maybe church planting was in our future, for my wife and I was the lead pastor of a church already, and I had been the lead teaching pastor at North Park as well. So I think I was already leading at a pretty senior level. And, a good friend of mine said, Dom, it's kind of weird that, you're going to go from leading in a big setting to like go do something really small. And, I think this, Matt, as Christians, that's not the way we discern a call, right? It has nothing to do with how big something is or how something is small, right? It has to do with obedience in the season that God calls you in. So I had a sense that maybe God was stirring in me and in our church at the time where I was pastoring that we should help a church in Quebec. And it was more like a missions kind of initiative. It was like, maybe we should support a local church in Montreal. I grew up in Montreal. That would be a nice thing. And as part of that discernment with our church, somebody said to me, Dom, what if as part of that, God's calling you to go back to Montreal? And I'm like, that's never going to happen. Like I was not like even thinking about that. Our church was growing. Things were healthy. My wife actually grew up in the town where I was pastoring. So we were close to her family. And that little kind of comment was just always lingering in my thoughts as I prayed. And as I thought about just the unique need that I knew was kind of happening here in Montreal. The other thing I think that started to happen in my discernment is God somehow in my quiet times was bringing to my attention a lot of my friends or family members that I knew that had stopped going to church. And I kind of developed this new burden for people who I loved, who had disconnected from the story of Jesus somehow, either because of church hurt, either because of like the story of faith wasn't making sense anymore. And I started to think, wow, I mean, we're going to need a new paradigm to help people just hear Jesus speaking to them again. What does it mean for people to feel drawn back into the family of God, or a new generation that has very little church hurt? They just have no category for church, right? So I remember thinking, I hope God sends somebody to Montreal. Like, that'd be great, but I'm not going. And then I remember telling my wife, and she had agreed that we would never live in Montreal. Like, I mean, that was checkmate, right? I'm like, we're not doing this. So just fast forward, when I told my wife that I sensed that maybe God is stirring something new in me, I just asked her to pray. And I just said, would you just pray and see if you're sensing anything that's close to that? And at that time, I would still say we were still just thinking about maybe we just need to help a church in Montreal or come to work in a church somewhere in the city. It wasn't clear that I was going to church plant. Like I said, I was discerning coming back here, but not how I would come back. So I think for anyone who's listening, that's an important step. Sometimes church planting sounds, I don't know, glamorous or cool or edgy or entrepreneurial. If you have to learn some skills about church leadership, it's always wiser to work in a church for a while where you're developing some of those muscles, because church planting will test all of that. And so just fast forward, because I had been a lead pastor, there was a few lead pastor friends of mine that I asked to pray with me in confidence, just confidentially, just pray. And then they still started to affirm that sense of like, Dom, the person we know you are and the person God has shaped you to be seems like the kind of person that would go do this. And then they also took it another step. They said, if you sense God calling you to go, we might be ready to prayerfully consider supporting you financially. And that was kind of God, I guess, confirming some of the realistic fears I had. Like, how do you take care of a family? How do you pay the bills? And so I was paying attention to all those discernment streams, if we just call them, like different paths of discernment. I had the burden, and I don't think anybody should go without the burden. I had the years of kind of tested skills and learning. I had that, but now I needed a structure of realistic survival. And that was a part of it too. And then as those things came together, my wife and I just sensed that Jesus had given us enough clarity to take the first step. And so we knew that if we didn't step now, we would be disobedient, because he had been so faithful in helping those things. And we stepped out in faith almost 10 years ago now to head back here. Now, again, anybody who's listening who started a church or is an entrepreneur who started a business knows, we had no idea where we'd be located, how the church would look. We didn't know those things. We just knew we would come back here, prayerfully just begin to meet with some friends, family, people we knew that were open to exploring faith, maybe in a new kind of way. Many of them had left church, not going to church. And we did that for 6 months in small group settings as I just kind of, ran around, had a lot of coffee, made a lot of mistakes, that kind of stuff.
Yeah. Well, fast forward now, this summer, you
Yeah.
have a book coming out called The Bible for a Shifting Secular Age,
Yeah.
Hearing the Truth You Need for the Life You're Meant to Live.
Yeah.
How much of this book is shaped by the last 10 years?
Oh my goodness. I would say so much of it. So much of the things that I wanted to write about kind of bubbled up in my heart, jotting down little notes, little questions after a coffee meeting or after a conversation with somebody in my family who doesn't believe in God and yet was asking such spiritual questions. I'm like, how can the scriptures and a church that is living and attentive to where people are at today, how can we, in a sense, be bridge builders for people, especially when in their minds, they didn't believe that the Bible or the church cared about those kinds of things. They had somehow convinced that spirituality is private or it's done through a wellness, yoga, some other place, which again, you can experience that. But the link back to the life of the church, to the ways of the Holy Spirit, to the ways the scriptures talks about healthy spirituality weren't connecting. And I'm like, we're going to have to reclaim the gift of the scriptures for this age. And that's going to happen because we build the bridge on our side, because nobody who left church is building a bridge from their side. So I started to think about getting honest about rethinking secular culture. So one of the things I try to do in the book is to say that the ways we've probably been told to define a secular culture have never really materialized in the way that was once said. The common narrative of secular, when people hear the word secular, they often hear of people who are against God, against the Bible, want nothing to do with church, kind of a lot of confrontational terms. And again, that happens a little bit, but we were noticing something that was also happening at the same time, is that people were just interested, curious. Some of them are like, I think of a conversation that someone said to me when I told them I was a pastor here back in Montreal, my hometown, like starting this church, spiritual conversations about faith. I would use that language. And they asked me, like, when somebody does that, do you call the Pope in Rome for them to give you like the okay? And I was like, that's such a great question that you would think that I would have to do that. Mm-hmm. And I realized, I wonder how many other questions people have where I assume like church planting, you're going to know what that means. And they're like, what is church planting? Who does this? So I realized we had to reimagine all of our language for a world that was secular and very open to having conversations, very hungry for meaning and purpose and understanding the Bible. And the 180 basically was trying to do that from the ground up, right? I still remember handing people their first Bible they've ever had in their life, opening it up, and them asking me, like, why is there numbers in this Bible? Like, what do we do with the numbers? I'm like, oh, those are chapters and verses. And they're like, oh, okay. I'm like, this is amazing. Like, we're starting like from scratch with some people, right? So the book comes out of that desire to help the church today and leaders think more carefully about a secular culture and not simplify the narrative by just saying secular culture is just easily this. It's actually much more complex. And to say there's many things we might want to learn from a secular culture that will help us to know how to re-articulate the story of Jesus for people today. And so I do that by talking about the Bible as well.
What was some of the biggest surprises for you? I'm assuming this came out of the book, like even as you thought yourself about a secular culture and then experienced it. What were some of the biggest surprises that you found over the last 10 years with working in a secular environment like Quebec?
Yep. Well, I would say, because I was born in Montreal and, was raised here in the city, I was ready for a little bit more pushback and concern, just a bit of a confrontation with culture. Like, we don't need a church. But what I realized is that a secular culture doesn't really just struggle with church. It just has no category to know what to do with any religious group. And this came to my attention when we worked with the city and with different leaders around just a zoning situation for where the church meets. I remember going to the city in some meetings and they would say to me, there's a Jewish group that's looking for a synagogue. There's a group of Muslims that would like to worship in a mosque. And so I could see from a secular perspective, they're like, we don't know what to do with any of you. So it's, in a sense, I'm like, wait a second. It is so true that in a secular culture, all religion should be private. Most religious people are always fighting, and we don't want that in our cities. So I thought maybe we need to be more sensitive to how complicated we seem to people in a secular culture. Like Christianity is very complex, right? The other thing that I learned, and this is really talking to people in my family who have struggled with church and want nothing to do with God or the Bible, is that somebody once said to me that from a secular perspective, Christianity looks like a pluralistic religion. And I'm like, that is so true. I never realized that. They said if somebody even wanted to be a Christian and go to church, we wouldn't even know where to start because there's so many different Christians that are always fighting. And I'm like, wow. So now what do we do with that? Like, how do we invite people into the life of Jesus without demonizing other Christians, without just saying, well, we're right, everybody else is wrong? Like, how do we reframe that? And so that was a big learning that we're still living in. And in Quebec in particular, maybe listeners know this, the Roman Catholic Church, Protestant struggles, a lot of the tensions around that, they just, are almost augmented to a whole nother level than they would be in other parts of maybe Canada or the US. And we're not even talking about our Orthodox brothers and sisters, because that's a whole nother conversation. So those are the things I started to realize, that people in a secular culture, some might be frustrated with religion, but some of them are just like, we're just so confused. Like, can't we just be spiritual on our own? Like, do we need institutional structures? And I'm like, we don't have good, gentle, respectful ways of answering those questions, because oftentimes hearing those questions creates a type of defensiveness or a posture of like, you're trying to shut us down, or you don't want to let us pray, and that kind of thing. And I've had conversations with families where I'm like, we're concerned that the schools might not want us to pray in schools, but I know many families, many of you don't pray in your home, and that doesn't bother you at all. So, I mean, those are the deep conversations the church needs to be having.
So when you think about discipleship and the discipleship journey, where does it begin? And then as you're talking about some things that people would just assume, oh, everyone understands this, because they're still thinking as it being somewhat of a person with, oh, they have a bit of a Christian memory. What you're talking about is, no, these people are like, man, there's a whole bunch of streams of Christians. Yeah. How does that all work together? So where do you start with people who are there? Because I think regardless of where someone's listening from, if they were to be honest about surveying their own city and go to the places of their city that they would maybe say, man, those people there are really secular and progressive. Mm-hmm. This is going to be the same starting place likely that they need to begin with too. So where do you start?
I mean, for us, what we did, because maybe we were church planting and we were really thinking highly relationals, we just start with where people are at and sit with them in their questions and sit with them in their struggles. I think we were very sensitive to the fact that when people brought grief related to a church story, we didn't provide like a polished answer to know how to fix that or magically, remove that. We just said, hey, this is kind of the dark side of those who have maybe said yes to Jesus, but have not really been transformed by his grace or his love. And so I think you start by listening to where people are at. The other thing is, I would say, Matt, is many people might have to just start with their own kids. I mean, we're not going to touch the complexities of secular culture if we don't even know how to listen to our kids who are rethinking faith and spirituality and everything else. So I think it's so great to think you're going to be a missionary somewhere around the world, but you're not able to hear that, that one of the most fascinating things with young people is like astrology apps are flying off the, Apple store. Interest in spirituality and the paranormal experiences and psychedelic drugs are like, everybody knows this now. Mm-hmm. And so if we're not realizing our kids who've been raised in wealthy or, blessed environments are still looking for meaning and they're exploring lots of spiritual things, as parents and grandparents, I think the one thing we can do is just sit with them and explore, like, why is this interesting? Or why has the story of Jesus not gripped their hearts in the way we hoped it would have, Is it possible that maybe in the church we're not articulating the story of Jesus in a way that's making sense for them? I think that's a big part of it, because Jesus is still building his church. So I think he knows how to do that. So I think we have to be honest with our own places of influence. So I would start there, in small places. What are the people in my life who are curious, unsure, confused, callous, and the biggest one, very comfortable, like just living a comfortable life, so they don't care about anything. And that is really the landscape of a secular culture, one that is a lot more nuanced, interested, curious than it is confrontational all the time. It's sometimes, confrontation takes a lot of work and people are like, I'm not fighting with you, just believe whatever you want. Indifference is actually much more challenging than argument.
Friends, we'll get back to my interview with Pastor Domenic Ruso in just a moment. Prior to that, however, I want to let you know about his new and upcoming book, The Bible for a Shifting Secular Age, Hearing the Truth You Need for the Life You Are Meant to Live. This book is an invitation to reimagine the uniqueness of the Bible at a time when we need its living words more than ever. Dom is a pastor, church planter, and theological practitioner in one of the most religiously complex places in North America. Readers will sense the need for a new dialogue about the shifts in culture, revealing a secular age we did not anticipate. While a challenge, a fresh perspective on the Bible as God's living words to us will be key to address the deepest longings bubbling up in our present secular age. Dom's book has been endorsed by Brian Stiller, Carrie Nieuwhof, Rich Vilotis, and Ken Shigematsu. If you want to learn more about Dom's book, you can visit domruso.com. Once again, that is domruso.com. And you can expect the book to be released on September the 1st, 2025. So you can go to Barnes & Noble and Amazon and pre-order the book. Once again, that is going to be Dom's new book, The Bible for a Shifting Secular Age. And please visit, once again, domruso.com. And now back to my interview with Dom. How has all of this shaped your life as a teacher? As I said, some of my earliest introductions to you was when you were serving as a teaching pastor. So how is this? I know you care about teaching. I know you care about communication.
Yeah.
Now in the process, you've written this book. I'm sure there'll be others in the future. Like how is all of this shaped how you communicate? Let's start with the Sunday services as a beginning place.
That's such a good question, Matt. I think I need to write more about this because I almost take it for granted that so much of this automatically triggers in me a natural way I think about the scriptures, a natural way that I invite people to explore the Bible. So on a Sunday morning, I think all of my team and our staff would say that we have just a natural default to always remembering that we're speaking to Christians and non-Christians at the same time. So we're very intentional about making room for people to say, it's safe to bring a friend or to invite a friend who's not sure what they believe about God. And we're going to present the Bible and we're going to talk about worship and we're going to talk about all the sacred things that make up the life of the church. But we're always going to think about translating that for them so they're not lost as we worship together. I think that is something everybody in our team either understands from the beginning or they learn as they go along and work on our staff and pick up our values. I think the easiest way to learn that is to just be around people that don't, like you're just around people who don't believe, right? Yeah. If it's family members, it's not something forced. It's just something natural. If you're chatting with somebody and they ask a question about the Bible, you're like, that's a great question. Let me think about that, right? So I don't know if I have any secret except be very sensitive to things that you can learn from somebody who doesn't believe in the story of Jesus yet. I'm more intentional about that. Like if there's a new person at our church that really struggles with the historicity of the story of Jesus, the canon, so I just will have coffee with them and say, tell me when you started wondering about this and tell me why you're visiting church. Or here's one thing I did intentionally. This might help listeners is early on when we started the church, there was a few people who were attending the 180 who clearly had told me like they're atheists. They're not sure they believe in God. They were visiting because they came with a friend, all that stuff. And whenever we would do something like, for example, we would do like talk about offering or talk about money, talk about like giving to the work of the church, I would always ask them, hey, was that weird when we did that? I would always ask them to help me hear that announcement from their perspective. I'm like, when I talked about the Holy Spirit, did that come across like strange? And so I almost like reminded them that they were a gift to us because we were learning by them being in our space. And then they would be like, why do you care what I think? I'm like, no, it's important. Like it really is important for us to hear. So that takes on its own value. And it became kind of the way we think about a lot of things. I mean, we don't do it that intentionally all the time, not because our church is bigger. So it's a bit harder, but it's in our DNA, I think, to think that way.
I would always say in sermon preparation, I'm imagining if I think of a friend, a non-Christian friend, I'm thinking about sharing this as if they're sitting right there and I'm trying
Exactly.
to explain it to them. Even now with my own kids, like the other day, my youngest was like, Jesus and God aren't the same thing. And then my oldest son was like, no, actually they are. I don't really understand it though. It's pretty confusing.
Yeah.
I was like, okay, is this my teaching moment? I'm going to wait till another time. But you realize you're like, oh my goodness, there are all of these things again that in the midst of the rhythms and the rituals at times, maybe we don't think of them as rituals, but the rituals are things we repeat over and over again. We just don't go, wait, hold on a second. This is really confusing. Like I remember one time in Alpha with someone, the woman was like, so like, where's Jesus right now?
Mm-hmm. That's a good question.
So as you're doing your sermon preparation, as you're thinking through things, as you said, the one thing you'll do is you'll go out with somebody individually. I think there can also be probably a tension in like, how much do I explain as I'm going through, the flow of a, 25, 35 minute message? Like, what do I want to highlight? What do I want to cut? Could you just give us a little bit of this is what I'll cut. This is what I'll include.
Yeah.
One of the best bits of sermon feedback I got in the early days was, Matt, just because you find it interesting doesn't mean everyone's going to find it interesting, but you're also trying to do enough background that the person sitting there who's going, okay, what is this whole
I mean,
thing?
it's a bit of a question on delivery, sermon prep, communication. And I mean, I love those topics and we should record another episode just on that stuff.
Mm-hmm.
But I would say just for the listener, I always have to remember that I am a pastor pastoring people who are already Christians as well.
Mm-hmm.
And so I have to live in this tension. And this is a tension that I think more leaders and pastors need to develop, is that there is a point in the text where Jesus speaks both to the non-Christian and the Christian in a way that they can both understand, that Jesus is speaking to them. And I think finding that place is the skill of communicating, at least if you're going to be a preacher in the future in a secular culture, right? It's not an easy thing, but it's something that takes reps to live in the text and prayerfully say, Jesus, you had a way that the religious leader who knew the law knew that you were saying something to them. And the person who's just new to the story or hurting and unsure that God cared about them at all, they sensed that you were also speaking to them. And so in some ways, Jesus, because you're the great teacher, you need to help me think of where that place is today. And so one of the compliments and one of the blessings of being a pastor and a teacher is for people who've been Christians for 30 years to say, I never thought like that passage was a passage that meant that, or, was God helping me see that? And then you have a new person who's there for week 2 and they're like, oh, I understood that. Like Jesus makes a bit more sense today, right? So it's, some passages I think lend themselves easier to that kind of preaching. Others take a bit more work. The other thing too is I would say regularly when I'm preparing a sermon, I'll often pause to remind people who are new to the story to tell them about a time when I didn't believe the story yet. So I'll often use that as a tool to say, you know what, I remember the first time I heard this story and I was like, this doesn't make any sense to me. And maybe for some of you, it doesn't make any sense either. And then I'll add one last thing. To the disciples of Jesus who are listening to this for the first time, they don't understand either. So in like 1 minute, I just put us all on the same ground.
Yeah.
And now everybody's like, oh my goodness, we're all at the same place at the story, right? And so those are kind of maybe communication tools available. Once you get the people there, then you can walk with them no matter where they are. And obviously it's the work of the Spirit that is making the text also much more pertinent to a person depending where they are in their story and in their journey. And also, sometimes we need to tell people like this part of the Christian faith, if you're newer to Christianity, might not make sense, and that's normal until you're further along in the faith. Jesus will do that at times, He'll say there's so many things I want to tell you now, but you're not ready to understand them. So I think he's still doing that. But it's different that people feel welcome to stay in the game when they feel that versus like, oh, I'll come back to church when I'm smart enough or something. We're like, no, this is great.
How have you become more reliant on the Holy Spirit over the last 10 years?
Yeah. I think stepping out in faith to plant this church, not that I didn't, have to learn about trusting God in faith before, but planting a church is just a different kind of space, leadership space. I think one of the places that I would say the Holy Spirit has been most real, most present to me is as I think about leading our church and embodying what it means to be a dad. You know, my wife and I often say that our step to plant the church was worth 10,000 sermons to my kids. You know, there's one thing to hear dad preach about trusting God and teach about, the Bible and Jesus. There's another thing for them to see us step out in faith in moments where we're not sure what the next year is going to look like, but Jesus is going to show us, It's those moments that have been really meaningful where the Spirit of God has, I wouldn't say given us the answer or made things always clear, but he's kind of been with us even in some messy moments. And those have been a bit, I would say, markers along the 10-year journey where I'm like, okay, God, if you answer this prayer in this way, this is what might happen. If you answer this prayer in this way, this is what might happen. It's like, when you read those books and they have choose your own adventure things, you pick a page and you can go different directions. It felt a bit that way. And I kept reminding myself that God wrote the whole book, no matter what adventure I picked. Right. So that was reassuring. And yet he was like, I'm going to teach you something new now. Offering is going to be low for a while. You're like, okay. Or here's a new thing. The church that said they would help you during COVID are going to call you and tell you they're not helping you anymore. I'm like, okay, that's a new adventure. And in the end, I was always like, I think I went back to that initial call of saying, Jesus, I think you called me here. And if you only called me here for 2 years, then I want to be faithful for those 2 years until you show me otherwise. If you call me here for 20 years, then I'll be faithful in that. So I would say the Holy Spirit has been teaching me that kind of listening, and I guess you would call it discernment. Also, there's a particular kind of risk taking. If you don't learn that, I don't think you could ever take risks that are required when you start something like a church. It's like you have to take certain risks. Yeah, that's a good question. Great question, man.
There was a church planner told me recently, a Tim Keller quote, or no, it was a John Tyson. John Tyson was mentored by Keller, but he said, what do you ask church planners when you're trying to assess them? He said, what's your pain tolerance?
Yeah.
And then he said, what's the second question? What's your wife's pain tolerance?
Yeah.
As you've made this move, you've referred to your kids a couple of times in this. Speak to pastoring, sowing, planting the gospel to your kids who are also in the midst of a secular culture, a secular environment, and also pastoring your church and being their pastor as well.
Yeah. Wow. I mean, that's such a good question and such an important one that I think we're still trying to figure out across the board. I think our kids, we would say this, no matter who's listening, our kids will pick up what we believe mostly by what they see us model, especially early on. They're going to see us model certain things. Because in my case, my kids are different ages and they're moving into different, I would say one's an older teenager, one's really young. I think as parents, you just have to watch your kids that they're different and you have to handle their exploring, questioning, doubting very differently. In our home, I think we've always said to them, we want it to be safe. It's been a little bit easy because our church has this DNA anyway. It's safe for you to just be you when we're at church and when we're at home. How they see me at home is how they see me when I'm preaching. So they know dad is the same person everywhere. That's important. Where in some other settings, there could feel like your dad at home and then you're different a little bit in church. I mean, I am different in how I lead certain things, but not how they see me as the leader. Also, I think one of the things I keep thinking about often is I think the greatest gift to the church in the future is us learning from our kids. I didn't naturally grow up with that framework. I grew up in a culture where an older person never needed to learn from a younger person. It was always a younger person that. So I think that there is something about just the pace of change, young people engaging things in a different way. We need to create a posture of saying, what can we learn? I mean, some things we can't learn from younger people, but some things we can. And so a model that I often try to practice is I try to think of having 2 mentors in my life. And I've said this before in other contexts. One mentor is 10 years older than me, and one is 10 years younger than me. And both of them mentor me. And so they mentor me differently, but I'm attuned to them to learn to listen from them. And so I've been blessed to have some older mentors that I still call and bounce ideas with. And then I have some younger people that are faithful. I see them in the church regularly. Some of it's my own kids, and say, you know what, you're playing this game, or there's this movie that came out, or there's this weird trend thing. Tell me a bit about that, or why do you like that? And when they tell me they're interested, I don't just say, oh, that's good for you. I'm like, oh, can I listen in with you?
Mhm.
Or can I watch this with you? Or can I? So you naturally kind of say, okay, I need to kind of grapple with this a bit. How would Jesus be present with a young person in this moment? How would he do that? One of the things we're trying to do that with at our church, just to bring back Jason and his connection to Alpha and our love of Alpha. For the listeners, Alpha is this wonderful evangelistic tool about thinking about the gospel, about presenting the story of Jesus to people who are just kind of starting off. We are piloting this idea this year with the Alpha Youth videos that have been relaunched, the new ones. And we're trying to think about having it where parents and their kids both watch the videos. And then we separate them, and then we spend time just with parents so that we listen to how the parents process the videos and then versus how their kids process the videos.
Yeah, great idea.
So that the parents can feel the pace of which their kids live at. Because the videos are like super fast and disorienting. And at times, I think we can think, oh, that's just young people and the world, and we don't have to worry.
Yeah.
I'm like, that's the book of Acts.
Mm-hmm.
So buckle up, So those are just little things that we're just trying, because our posture is we want to be learning all the time. So I would say my kids are part of that mentoring space, that learning space. Because I wasn't a pastor's kid, I think my kids are going through something I really don't understand. So I'm always sensitive to the fact of like, is it weird that your dad's a pastor or preacher in the church? Is that strange? I don't have that reference point. So I really need to listen to them.
How has Jesus become more sweet to you over the years? And, maybe thinking more specifically about the environment you're ministering, pastoring in, and planting in.
I always have one story that I think about when I think about how good Jesus has been to me, and how, how kind and gracious he's been to not only me, but I think our leadership, our calling. My sense of calling is that in year one of the church plant, I remember having probably a few moments where I sat alone at my desk and just wanted to cry, and thinking, I have a lot of leadership experience. I think I know the scriptures well, but I have no idea what we're going to do now. And I remember having a season where I thought, God, if you led me to plant the church because you want me to die or you want me to experience pain, that's fine. But this feels so hard and I have no idea what to do next, And I remember in a quiet moment, one time this happened and it's marked me in such a deep way. I remember the sense that Jesus said to me, I've called you to plant the church because I love you. And I was like, what? I paused and I'm like, I don't understand. And I think over time, as I went back to that moment, I realized that church planting for me was the best place I needed to be in to see that Jesus loved me deeply. And so I would say that every time I go through a difficult season, I tell myself, I'm not doing this because Jesus needs me. I'm not doing this because I'm better than someone else. I'm not doing this because people need a church, which is all true, right? It's like, I'm doing this because this is the best place for Jesus to show me how much he loves me. And so I think that's made this season a little bit almost like, I don't know, like the burden of it changes. You're like, hey, wow, this is kind of amazing. This is where Jesus will show me that he loves me. So the sweetness of who Jesus is takes on like a different taste. And I've held on to that moment a lot, because every time I've had like a dark place, I'm like, wait a second, it's because Jesus loves me. That's why I'm here right now. So I have to kind of see, have to see where that is. Yeah. And he's been really faithful, and things have gone well. The church is getting healthier as we speak. There's a lot of exciting things. I don't know if this has been your experience, Matt, but I often tell our team that churches either have two modalities. One is dying pains and the other is growing pains. And dying pains are ones you want to avoid like the plague.
Yeah.
So we're in a season of growing pains, but there's a lot of pain. There's pain and blessing. And we're just trying to navigate that this season.
Just as we close, Dom, what are you encouraged about related to the church in Canada?
I think I'm encouraged that many of our evangelistic kind of ideas are just dying. And this is great news for us. I often say that Quebec is the place where most evangelistic ideas come to die. And I think that's just good news for us, that we can celebrate things that have worked for years, and we can just get as honest and as fast as possible admit those things are not going to work anymore. And I think it's good news that the church in Canada, at least, is starting to realize that. I mean, some people are going to fight that, but you're going to lose. It's like, trying to fight off a tsunami. Sorry, just you better learn how to swim because the tsunami is coming. And so I'm encouraged that we're getting more honest about that. I'm encouraged that there's a paradigm shift around theological training that has to happen. And we're seeing this across many schools and how we think about training leaders. So that's encouraging. It might sound painful to listeners, but there's an encouragement in the pain of admitting we need a new chapter now. Yeah, I'm encouraged that like the deeper sense of unity that's going to be needed across denominations and across Christian groups to survive this age, which maybe is the only thing that would have brought us together. It's just we're going to need to learn from our Orthodox brothers and sisters and our Catholic brothers and sisters and our different Protestant. We're going to have to learn from each other. We're going to need a more united picture of how the good news of Jesus brings us together rather than, and again, I don't want listeners to think that doesn't mean we don't disagree on things, but we should be careful that people who are not Christians don't hear the disagreement first, and how do we do that? So I'm encouraged at that. Yeah, I would say those are the big things that I'm hopeful about, that we can see some new things emerge now that we've never seen before.
Well, Dom, thank you for joining the Sowers podcast, for sharing your journey with us. And we'll be providing links for the book that'll be coming out soon. And as I say to every writer, thank you for committing the time, the pain to write it and the process of editing. I know it's not easy. So thank you for doing that.
Yeah. Thanks, Matt. Thanks for having me. Thanks for the listeners. I hope this encourages them. I don't know, if we said something thoughtful and encouraging, we could do part 2 at some point.
Well, friends, I'm sure you would agree that there is so much from my conversation with Pastor Dom Ruso that could be applied as this episode's action step. We covered a lot of territory talking about secular culture, talking about communication style, and how to reach those within our culture. Dom has a long history and background of leading, of pastoring, and now of church planting, the 180 in the greater Montreal region. And the thing that I think we ought to focus on as relates to this episode's action step is some of the misconceptions that we make of secular people. Dom said a number of things in this conversation that I think were helpful. One is confrontation takes a lot of work. And so oftentimes secular people, they don't want to get into that. They just, okay, you believe what you believe, I'm going to believe what I believe. And he said one of the ways that we can meet people where they are is to actually meet people where they are, not to make assumptions about what they believe or what they don't. And so oftentimes when it comes to our environments, our secular culture, people just really don't know what to do with us as Christians. They're not necessarily confrontational. They're not necessarily angry, hardened atheists, as we've talked repeatedly about on this podcast. They're just people that may have some curiosity. They may be callous, but oftentimes they could even be curious, but really they just have no idea what it is that you believe. And again, if you were to kind of put yourself in a similar situation, imagine there were multiple mosques all across your city. They had different titles on the outside of them. There seemed to be some differences. There seemed to be disagreements between them. You would likely be confused unless you had a bit of a background in the religious history of Islam. And so as a Christian, think about that. We are oftentimes in cities where there are different church buildings all over the place in our cities, even in some secular environments, and many of them have different titles and different names. And some of our disagreements are on more display in the media than other things. And so I think, again, if you put that in context, I think we should really be thinking about how do we clarify and bring opportunities for conversation where people can genuinely ask their questions and we can respond in love and in care, not out of confrontation, but out of clarifying and building relationships so that people can come to trust us and then be able to hear what it is that we have to say. Again, give that some consideration as you respond to this episode. Well, friends, I am now going to leave you with a clip from the conversation that will be released next week with Brent Ingersoll of King's Church, which is in Atlantic, Canada. Really excited for you to hear that conversation. And once again, if this episode has blessed and encouraged you, why don't you go ahead and share it with someone? Thanks, everyone. We'll talk to you soon.
We're at the front end of what I think is going to be a prolonged season of harvest. The thing I would say to church leaders is open your eyes. The fields are ripe unto harvest. I was in a cohort in Atlanta, Georgia, a couple of weeks ago with some pastors from the States, and they were talking about their situation and ministering in that context, and they're terrified that America ends up like Canada, right? and I was like, actually, guys, as far as the business of the kingdom of God, these are the best days I've ever seen. It is incredible to be selling ice cream in the Sahara Desert.